What would happen if one of our heroes were to claim the One Ring and use it to overthrow Sauron? How many different Dark Lords could there have been? Maya Govan and Melanin are Menex Wilaid. My name's Rainbow Dave and welcome to a Tolkien Untangled What If lore video. Today I'll be talking about what could have happened in Middle-earth if the One Ring had been claimed and used by one of the Free Peoples instead of being destroyed. And so this will, of course, be quite a speculation-heavy video, although I'll draw most of what I talk about from some part of Tolkien's writings. But anyway, the first thing to be aware of before I begin is that one of the major themes in all of Tolkien's writings is that the story is unfolding in accordance with the capital P plan of Eru Ilúvatar, the guy who created all life and the entire universe, the source of everything. And Eru Ilúvatar is a good god. Melkor wove discord into the Song of Creation, and so all is not perfect, but in the end, in Ilúvatar's own words to Melkor, no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me. Nor can any alter the music in my despite, for he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. So there really is only one way that things could have gone, and that is the way that things did go. The way Eru Ilúvatar designed them. And all those who rebelled against Ilúvatar and did evil in his creation, like Melkor and Sauron, did in the end prove themselves to be nothing but Ilúvatar's instrument in the fulfillment of his designs. Anyway, that's not going to stop me from speculating on what could have been, but I do think it's an important thing to be aware of, simply because as I go through a few different scenarios in this video for different characters from different races who could maybe have claimed the One Ring and tried to wield it, you will see that they all share a similar ending. If anything had been different in the story, even like a seemingly good thing, such as Gandalf not falling in Moria, or Boromir not being corrupted by the ring, or Gollum not showing up at the cracks of doom to bite the ring from Frodo's finger, any change in pretty much any character's story would have resulted in a far worse ending than the one we got. I don't want to spoil the whole rest of this video, but every one of these scenarios that I'm going to talk about ends terribly for the Free Peoples of Middle-earth. A central theme of The Lord of the Rings is that the ring cannot be used for good. Not ever. Not by anyone. And if you want to know more about the details of why this is and how exactly the One Ring works, then check out last week's video after this one to learn all about the powers and the nature of the One Ring. But I'll begin this video by focusing on Aragorn and the race of men, and how the story might have gone if the One Ring had been claimed and wielded by King Elessar in the final years of the Third Age. And for the sake of doing Aragorn's character justice here, let's say that in this scenario, the ring came to him peacefully. He didn't take it by force or with malicious intent. We'll just say that he reluctantly took it from Frodo's body after he hypothetically died. Let's imagine that in this version of events, Boromir was never corrupted by the ring, so Frodo never left the Fellowship when he did, so he was still hanging around when the orcs attacked at Armon Hen, and in that fight he was killed. We'll also say that other than that, things mostly went the same. Boromir is also killed, and Merry and Pippin are captured. And at this point in the original story, Aragorn is already split between his duty to go to Minas Tirith and his duty to help Frodo travel into Mordor. But if the ring were now in Aragorn's possession, the consequences of this decision would be 10 times more important. Even so though, I do reckon he would still go after Merry and Pippin. Abandoning them to the orcs that killed Boromir, and in this version Frodo, would seem very out of character. So let's say Aragorn goes off with Legolas and Gimli and probably Sam too to hunt down the Uruk-hai through the lands of Rohan. Now I know that the One Ring is considered a burden and it slowed Frodo on his way to Mordor, but I actually think it would have the opposite effect on Aragorn. In this moment, he would be carrying it west, towards Isengard and away from Mordor. And we know that the One Ring has a power to enhance the natural abilities of its bearer, and Aragorn was known as Wingfoot and Strider even without the ring. So I imagine that with the ring he would have been able to travel even more rapidly and even more tirelessly, and he would probably have caught up with the Uruk-hai before Eomer and his Eored slaughtered them in the night. However it went down, I have no doubt that Aragorn, with Andúril and the One Ring, and Legolas and Gimli, and Vengeful Sam, and potentially even the aid of Eomer and his riders, yeah, they could definitely kill the Uruk-hai, no problem. And if Aragorn were there, Merry and Pippin probably would never have fled into Fangorn. And no doubt this fighting would have been noticed by Gandalf the White, who had taken up residence on the eaves of Fangorn, and he would have revealed himself to his friends, and so the 7 surviving members of the Fellowship would be reunited. And at this point, Aragorn would be forced to make his first big decision as the Ring-bearer. What to do next? Gandalf, I'm sure, would continue to counsel that the ring should be destroyed, and I think Aragorn would probably agree. I guess it's easy to imagine that as a mortal man, Aragorn would be pretty immediately corrupted by the ring, like movie Isildur was, but I really don't think this is how it would go. Isildur in the books bore the ring for 2 years, and in that time he remained an honourable and proud yet noble king of the Dúnedain, just like Aragorn. Remember, in the books, #Isildur did nothing wrong. So I think it's very unlikely that Isildur's heir would be corrupted right away. I think Aragorn would agree with Gandalf that the ring must be destroyed, at least in word, but things would begin to change when he met Eomer. You see, Aragorn has a personal connection to Rohan. He fought there under the alias of Thorongil during the rule of Theoden's father. And upon learning the extent of Saruman's treachery, I imagine Aragorn would have ridden with the men of Rohan, and wielding the One Ring, he would have led them in their war against Saruman. But he would not have done this as a usurper or as a warlord. We are told that even without the One Ring, Aragorn is a man that others would naturally choose to follow. When he passes the Argonath in Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien writes that Frodo turned and saw Strider, and yet not Strider, for the weather-worn ranger was no longer there. In the stern sat Aragorn, son of Arathorn, proud and erect. His hood was cast back and his dark hair was blowing in the wind. A light was in his eyes, a king returning from exile to his own land. And a few chapters later, Aragorn is described as looking like some king out of the mists of the sea who had stepped upon the shores of lesser men. So, considering that the ring enhances the natural abilities of its bearer, I think ring-bearing Aragorn would be the mightiest king of men that walked in Middle-earth since the days of Isildur and Elendil. And I guess it's hard to say whether the whole Ent storyline would have played out with the same timing if Merry and Pippin were never in Fangorn, but either way, Saruman's armies were defeated by the men of Rohan without Aragorn the ring-bearer leading them, and so I can't believe that things would have been too much different in this version. And honestly, I think Aragorn's role in the rest of the story up until his arrival at the Battle of Pelennor Fields would pretty much follow the original Lord of the Rings. Upon leaving Isengard, Aragorn would still have seen the beacons of Gondor, and he would probably have still met up with the Grey Company and still have taken the paths of the dead and still have shown up at the Battle of Pelennor Fields with reinforcements in the Black Ships. But whatever skill and might Aragorn possessed without the ring would be enhanced tenfold in this new version of events. However, I think everything would then begin to change when Aragorn marched on the Black Gate. I believe at this point in the story, Aragorn would still probably intend to destroy the ring, but he would go to Mordor as a king with an army instead of in secret like Frodo does. And to be honest, Tolkien tells us that this is something Sauron would have been very afraid of. Gandalf tells us that not for nothing does Sauron fear Aragorn. And if Aragorn wielded the One Ring, then I imagine many of Sauron's mannish allies would have turned against him. Most of the Haradrim and the Easterlings did not serve Sauron out of loyalty, they served him out of fear. And I think Aragorn would definitely present himself as a noble and benevolent king of men who would free Sauron's slaves from his dominion. Aragorn with the ring would look like a liberator to these men and a seemingly kind alternative to Sauron. But we know this is not how things would have ended. In letter 246, Tolkien wrote that the ring was entirely under Sauron's will, and in his presence none, but very few of equal stature, could have withheld it from him. Of mortals, no one, not even Aragorn. The ring would have made him perhaps the mightiest king of men ever to rule, but we know that Aragorn could never have mastered it. In the end, it would have mastered him, and there are any number of ways that it could have played out, but I feel like every single one of them ends with Aragorn dying and Sauron reclaiming the ring. As long as it exists, Sauron will endure, and there is no mortal in all of Middle-earth of equal stature to a Maiar. Perhaps in the short term, Aragorn might have become some incredible king of unprecedented power, but the ring would inevitably end up mastering him. In Return of the King, Gandalf tells Denethor that if Boromir had taken the ring and brought it to Minas Tirith, he would have stretched out his hand to this thing, and taking it, he would have fallen. He would have kept it for his own, and when he returned, you would not have known your son. Now, I think Aragorn would probably have resisted the ring a little bit longer than Boromir, but in the end we know that he could not have destroyed it. Literally no one can. That's kind of the point. And so, after potentially years of wielding the ring against Sauron, Aragorn would also eventually have fallen, and upon returning to Minas Tirith, his people would not have known their king. He would have been Aragorn no longer. But what if, instead of Aragorn claiming the ring, it was a hobbit who claimed it? When Frodo placed the ring on his finger at the cracks of doom and declared, "The ring is mine," could he have challenged Sauron? Could he have ordered the Nazgul to obey him? With all his hobbit resilience, could Frodo have become the new Lord of the Rings? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is no. But again, in letter 246, Tolkien actually goes into a huge amount of detail on what exactly would have happened at the end of the quest if Gollum hadn't shown up and bitten the ring from Frodo's finger. As you know, as soon as Frodo put on the ring and claimed it as his own, Sauron became instantly aware of him, and he was filled with terror. Sauron's fear rose like a vast black smoke to choke him, for he knew his deadly peril and the thread upon which his doom now hung. Throughout his realm a terror ran, his slaves quailed and his armies halted. At his summons there flew, faster than the winds, the Nazgul, and with a storm of wings they hurtled southward to Mount Doom. And this seems to imply that maybe Frodo was a very real threat to Sauron in this moment. Maybe he could have mastered the ring and overthrown the Dark Lord, but in his letter, Tolkien explains why this isn't the case. He writes that the Nazgul were in no way deceived as to the real lordship of the ring. Frodo had become a considerable person, but of a special kind, in spiritual enlargement rather than an increase of physical or mental power. He needed time, much time, before he could control the ring, before his will and arrogance could grow to a stature in which he could dominate other wills. The Nazgul would have greeted Frodo as Lord, With fair speeches they would have induced him to leave the cracks of doom, for instance to look upon his new kingdom that he must now claim and turn to his own purposes. Once outside the chamber, some of them would have destroyed the entrance, and a confrontation of Frodo and Sauron would have taken place. Its result was inevitable. Frodo would have been utterly overthrown, crushed to dust, or preserved in torment as a gibbering slave. Just like Aragorn and Isildur and any other mortal who could have tried to claim the One Ring, Frodo would ultimately have ended up doing Sauron's work for him, and sooner or later Sauron would have risen again to take dominion over all things. So let's turn now to the question of what would happen if an elf claimed the One Ring and tried to wield it against its maker. I guess there really are only two credible choices for who this elf would be, and Tolkien wrote about both of them in regards to answering this question. So I will start with Elrond, and I guess there are two possible scenarios in which Elrond could have acquired the ring, the first one being that he might have taken it from Isildur by force, way back after the War of the Last Alliance, but I don't really see this as being in any way probable. Elrond is a good guy, and Isildur is his kin. He is a direct descendant of Elrond's brother. In Isildur's possession, I really don't believe that the ring could have corrupted Elrond to such an extent and so quickly that he would have committed murder. But if he did, I think the consequences would be immediately disastrous. Acquiring the One Ring by murdering its previous bearer is exactly how Smeagol got the ring, and you don't need me to tell you how badly that ended for Smeagol. Also, murdering Isildur for the Weregild of Elendil would almost certainly have caused a massive war between the Dunedain and the elves loyal to Dark Elrond, and regardless of how that war turned out, the Third Age would have been an absolute mess from day one. However, the much more likely way that Elrond could have gained the One Ring would have been much later when Frodo arrived in Rivendell after being stabbed by the Morgul knife. When Frodo wakes up, he finds that the ring has been fastened to a new chain around his neck while he was unconscious, which means that someone must have handled the ring whilst he was sleeping in Rivendell. We're not told explicitly who this was, but if it wasn't Gandalf, then it was almost certainly Elrond. So what would have happened if Elrond claimed the ring as his own while Frodo was recovering in Rivendell? Well, the answer to that is pretty much exactly the same as the answer to what would Galadriel have done if she had claimed the One Ring when Frodo offered it in Lothlorien. Tolkien wrote that both Galadriel and Elrond conceived of themselves as capable of wielding the ring and supplanting the Dark Lord, but they were wrong. It was part of the essential deceit of the ring to fill minds with imaginations of supreme power, but it was only an illusion, a deception. Both Elrond and Galadriel, especially Galadriel, are incredibly powerful beings, obviously, but they are not of equal stature to Sauron. And so they could not take mastery of his ring in a one-on-one confrontation. However, if either of them had the ring and they claimed it, they would become awe-inspiringly mighty. Tolkien wrote that Elrond or Galadriel would have proceeded in the policy now adopted by Sauron. They would have built up an empire with great and absolutely subservient generals and armies and engines of war until they could challenge Sauron and destroy him by force. And so, with the One Ring in their possession, both Elrond and Galadriel would have had the potency to build a great empire that they would have ruled absolutely. They would have the unquestioning subservience of any army, any warrior, or any place that they chose, and they would have the means to make themselves into the mightiest military power ever founded in Middle-earth. but they would have adopted the policy of Sauron, and so their empire would inevitably have turned to tyranny. In the Mirror of Galadriel chapter, we get Galadriel's own words on what she imagined she would do if the One Ring ever came to her. And she says, very iconically, "In place of the Dark Lord you will set up a queen, and I shall not be dark, but beautiful, and terrible as the morning and the night, fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair." And this is such a great passage because it shows us how the One Ring's corruption works. If Galadriel took the One Ring from Frodo when he offered it, she would not instantly become Sauron 2.0. She would be beautiful and fair and strong, and she would be loved. But she would also be terrible and dreadful, and all would despair. Good and evil would become indistinguishable under Galadriel's rule, and in her ambition to overthrow the Dark Lord, she would replace him and rule Middle-earth as a terrible queen. Except, actually, no, she wouldn't. In the Mirror of Galadriel chapter, Galadriel tells us what she imagines she would do with the ring, but in his letters, Tolkien tells us that she would not have succeeded. It's very possible, probable even, that Galadriel's empire and her army would spread over all of Middle-earth, and many parts of it would be beautiful, and she may even obliterate all of Sauron's armies, but when she came to Mordor, to overthrow him, to confront him alone, unaided, self-to-self in a battle of wills over mastery of his ring, she would not be strong enough. Remember, in Sauron's presence, none but very few of equal stature could have withheld it from him. And for all the power Galadriel possesses, she is not of equal stature. Neither is Elrond. In the end, both of them would do great and terrible things. They would raise armies and build empires, but they could never overthrow Sauron with his own weapon. Tolkien tells us that there's really only one character who could, and that is Gandalf. So, Gandalf is of course limited in the body of an old man. He's not a fully fledged Maiar anymore, but because he is an emissary of the Valar, and a creature of the same order as Sauron, an immortal spirit taking a visible physical form, Tolkien tells us that he alone might have had a chance at mastering Sauron. In chapter 2 of the first book of The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf comes to Frodo in the Shire to tell him the truth about Bilbo's old ring. And contrary to what we see in the movies, in this chapter, Gandalf straight up takes the ring from Frodo and holds it in his hand, twice in fact. So if we imagine that during this scene, right at the beginning of the story, instead of giving the ring back to Frodo, Gandalf decided, actually, you know what, I'm a wizard, this ring's way safer in my care than anyone else's, I'm gonna keep it. How would things play out from there? Well, Tolkien tells us that if Gandalf were placed in such a position where he wielded the ring against Sauron, it would be a delicate balance. On the one hand, the true allegiance of the ring is and always will be to Sauron. But on the other hand, Gandalf would have the superior strength, for his enemy would not be in possession of his greatest weapon. Perhaps if Sauron was also weakened by his long millennia of corruption and all the expenditure of will that he'd frittered away in dominating others, then maybe, just maybe, Gandalf might prove the victor. If this were the case, the consequences would be disastrous for Sauron. Unlike Aragorn or Frodo or Elrond or Galadriel, Gandalf actually is of equal stature with Sauron. Unlike all those others, Gandalf actually could potentially use the One Ring to destroy Sauron and to rid the world of his power to the same extent that would be achieved if the ring were destroyed. Gandalf is the only being in Middle-earth, except maybe Saruman, who might have what it takes to permanently vanquish Sauron, using his ring against him. But still, this would not be a happy ending. If Gandalf overthrew Sauron, the ring and all its works would have endured. It would have been the master in the end. We know that the ring cannot be willingly destroyed by anyone, and we know that wizards are not above corruption. In the Council of Elrond, Gandalf tells us that the strength of the ring is too great for anyone to wield at will, save only those who have already a great power of their own. But for them it holds an even deadlier peril. Consider Saruman. If any of the wise should with this ring overthrow the Lord of Mordor using his own arts, he would then set himself on Sauron's throne, and yet another Dark Lord would appear. And of all the different Dark Lords who could possibly end up ruling Middle-earth from Sauron's throne, Tolkien tells us that Gandalf, as Ring Lord, would have been the worst. He would have been far worse than Sauron. He would have remained righteous, but self-righteous. He would have continued to rule and order things for good and the benefit of his subjects according to his wisdom, which was and would have remained great. But in the margin, Tolkien wrote, "Thus, while Sauron multiplied evil, he left good clearly distinguishable from it. Gandalf would have made good detestable and seem evil." So, is there any being in all of Arda who could have wielded the ring without succumbing to it? Well, among the free peoples of Middle-earth, I think the answer is an unqualified no. But if we turn west across the sea and take a look at the beings who dwell in the undying lands of Valinor, we will find the Valar of crafting, the guy that Sauron studied under, Aule, the most powerful craftsman in all of creation. So, could Aule destroy the One Ring? Would he be free of its corruption? Well, honestly, Tolkien never wrote about Aule and the One Ring, so it's impossible to say for sure, but my instinct is no. Even Aule could not destroy the ring. Even Aule could not be free of its corruption. If he possessed it, he would undoubtedly have the power to vanquish Sauron forever, but even so, I think the One Ring would eventually master him. It would twist him into something else. If you disagree, then I imagine your argument will in some way revolve around Aule being so much more powerful than Sauron, and thus he would be so far out of Sauron's league that the One Ring just couldn't affect him. But I don't think that's right. This is not how power levels work in Tolkien's Legendarium. After all, Melkor is the mightiest of all the Ainur, but he was completely overpowered by Tulkas. And it's true that Aule is a Valar and Sauron is a Maiar, and in the great hierarchy of Ainur, Valar have greater authority than Maiar, but all Valar and Maiar were created by Ilúvatar. And so they are all equals in that respect. They all have the same source. And we also know that none of the Ainur, whether Maiar or Valar, are completely incorruptible. In a fairly obscure essay called Osanwe Kenta, Tolkien tells us that any one of the Valar might have taken the paths of Melkor and become like him. And considering that it was Melkor who originally corrupted Sauron, it is not beyond the realms of belief that Sauron's ring would also corrupt Aule. Especially considering that back in the beginning, Aule totally did set a precedent for rebelling against the will of Ilúvatar. We know that the One Ring manipulates and corrupts and enhances desire, and we know that Aule is a guy who definitely has desires. Way back, he desired to create a race of his own without the permission of Ilúvatar. and so in secret he created the first fathers of the dwarves. Now, I don't want to over-egg the pudding here. Aule did not create the dwarves because he was greedy, or prideful, or resentful, like Melkor was. He created them because he wanted children of his own to teach his craft to, and because he was impatient at waiting for the first elves to awaken. However, this was an act of rebellion against Iluvatar, and although he did very swiftly repent, and he was very swiftly forgiven, it all but confirms that Aule is not without the trait of ambition that the One Ring latches onto. I think it would have taken an incredibly long time, but eventually the ring's corruption would have crept into Aule's mind, and eventually it would have used his desire and ambition to master him. But what then about the one guy in Middle-earth who is seemingly free of the ring's dominion? The one guy on whom the ring has no effect whatsoever? Tom Bombadil. If Tom can be free of the ring, then surely Aule can too, right? Except I'm not sure that this is an apt comparison. Tom Bombadil and Aule are incredibly different beings, and in letter 144, Tolkien gives us a very interesting insight into why Tom Bombadil is such an exception to the ring's corruptive nature. In that letter, Tolkien wrote, "Tom Bombadil is not an important person to the narrative. The story is cast in terms of a good side and a bad side, beauty against ruthless ugliness, tyranny against kingship, and so on. But both sides, in some degree, want a measure of control. But if you have, as it were, taken a vow of poverty, renounced control, and take your delights in things for themselves, then the question of the rights and wrongs of power and control might become utterly meaningless to you." And that is what Tom Bombadil is. He is some kind of being who has taken a metaphorical vow of poverty, and thus exists independent of the whole good side versus bad side dichotomy. He has no want for a measure of control, he has no ambition, and so the ring has nothing to latch onto. It cannot affect him. But I think Tom Bombadil's resistance to corruption has nothing to do with his power, and everything to do with an absence of the concepts that the One Ring preys upon. But this is not the case for Aule. Aule is very much on the good side, and so just like Gandalf, he would use the ring to try and do good, but in so doing he would make good detestable and seem evil. I truly do believe that anyone who wants anything would eventually fall under the dominion of the ring. That's what it does. And although the ring itself may not be powerful enough to deliver to Aule what he actually desires, for example, I don't believe Aule with the ring would actually be powerful enough to create life without Iluvatar's permission, but at the end of the day, that's neither here nor there. Sam Gamgee recognized that the temptation of the ring is a cheat, and the visions it induces are only a deception, but given enough time, I think even Aule would be deceived by them, and in the end, the ring would master him too. And the consequences for the people of Arda would be horrendous. So, what's the point of this video? Well, I guess the bottom line is that evil can never be overcome by using a weapon of evil. The only way things could have worked out in Middle-earth is for the ring to be destroyed. There is no other way. There is no alternative. And so, to bring this theme into the real world for a moment, I'll leave you with a very thought-provoking quotation from Tolkien's letter 66. But before I quote from it, we need a little bit of historical context. So this letter was written in 1944, exactly a month to the day before D-Day, before the Normandy landings. And so, at the time this letter was written, broadly speaking, the question in England wasn't so much, is Nazi Germany going to win, but more, when is it going to lose? And of course, there are very easy to spot parallels between Sauron's ideology and Nazi ideology, and in this letter the Nazis are compared to the armies of Sauron. However, very, very interestingly, Tolkien does not compare the allies of World War II to his heroes in The Lord of the Rings. He compares them to his heroes if they tried to wield the One Ring against the enemy. A month before this letter was written, Allied bombers had targeted the city of Budapest, which at the time was occupied by the Germans, but it was facing an invasion from the Allied Red Army. And so the motive for this bombing campaign was to, help liberate Budapest from an evil occupation. But the method behind the motive was just dropping a ton of bombs on it, destroying it, raining ruin on an ancient city that can trace its origins all the way back to the Celts of Central Europe. And a month before that, the Allies had bombed the Vatican City for the second time during the war. They had bombed the centre of the Catholic faith. And only a week before that, the Soviet Air Force had bombed the Finnish capital of Helsinki, even though Finland was engaging in peace talks at the time. And you don't need me to tell you how significant Celtic themes were to Tolkien's writings, or how important his Catholic faith was to him and his mother, or how the Finnish language and Finnish mythology served as the germ from which the Silmarillion grew. These places mattered to Tolkien, and they were under threat from the Nazi ideology, but they were actually being destroyed by the Allies. And let me make this absolutely crystal clear. Tolkien was about as far from a Nazi sympathizer as one could possibly be. He wrote the sassiest letter in the world to a Nazi publishing house when they tried to translate The Hobbit into German, and he straight up referred to Hitler as a ruddy little ignoramus. That's Tolkien's exact words. However, although Tolkien recognised that Hitler and his evil ideology had to be fought, just as in The Lord of the Rings Sauron had to be fought, the enemy multiplied evil, but left good clearly distinguishable from it. Yet the allies were doing what Gandalf would have done if he wielded Sauron's ring. They were making good detestable and seem evil. So do take this letter with a pinch of salt, alright? It was written as a private piece of correspondence between a father and a son, and it was never intended to be made public, and when it was written, Lord of the Rings wasn't even remotely finished yet. But in 1944, Tolkien wrote that although fighting Hitler was a necessary thing in defeating evil, it was still an ultimately evil job. For we are attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring. And we shall, it seems, succeed. As I say, in 1944, the Third Reich was crumbling, but the penalty is, as you will know, to breed new Saurons, and slowly turn men and elves into orcs. Tolkien then went on to write, not that in real life things are as clear-cut as in a story, and we started out with a great many orcs on our side. So I guess the main takeaway from this video and this part of Tolkien's writings, apart from the cool speculation of how things could have gone in Middle-earth, is that evil cannot be undone with evil. Evil cannot be wielded by the good. The only way to overcome evil without simply replacing it is for that evil to be rejected and cast into the fire forever. There is no other way. Anyway, that got a little bit more real, honestly, than I expected it to, but I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss future Middle-earth videos, and hit like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer melyn.